No man will ever hurt you again." The giant cowboy swore as he faced down her abusive past. The wind came down off the red hills and crossed the town like a warning. It rattled the loose sign over the barber and carried grit along Main Street until it found the little clinic at the end of the lane. Inside, Clara Whitmore kept the lantern steady with one hand and stitched a ranch hand's brow with the other. She worked in the way she always did. Calm, neat, careful. At 29, she had learned how to make quiet feel like armor. She had learned how to keep her voice smooth even when the world around her shook. People said she was strong. What they meant was she'd survived. She was a widow now, and she treated the coughs and cuts of a hard town without asking many questions. The questions always led back to St. Louis, to a marriage that had left her with thin scars under the sleeves of her dress and a habit of listening for footsteps after dark. When she finished the stitches, she poured hot water from the kettle and washed the blood from the tin tray. The ranch hand thanked her and left the coin on the counter and ran for the door to beat the next gust. As he went out, he almost collided with a tall figure ducking in. The doorframe seemed to shrink around the man. He took off his hat at once, the way a man does who remembers his manners, and the lamplight showed a face cut by weather and years. Broad shoulders, a coat lined with dust. He had a cut along one knuckle, and blood darkening the edge of his sleeve. But he did not look down at the wound. He looked at Clara like he had come here for something larger than stitches. "Evening," she said, as she set the tray in the basin. Her voice did not show the quick beat in her chest. "If you're bleeding, sit there. I'll fetch more water." He didn't sit. He stood with the hat in his hands and nodded, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "Name's Elias Boone." She knew the name. Everyone did. Boone Ranch ran along the river for more miles than most men could ride in a day. She knew he rarely came to town. She knew he kept to himself. She did not know why he was in her doorway now, filling it like a gate. "I was breaking up foolishness at the saloon," he said, checking the tear on his knuckle as if it belonged to someone else. "Bar glass flew, nothing bad." "I'll decide that," she said lightly, though her hands had already found the clean cloth. "Sit, Mr. Boone." He sat. His knees still almost touched the counter. She cleaned the long knuckle and the inch of skin above it. The blood lifted easy, and the cut was simple, clean as a paper slice. She could fix it with 3 quick stitches or leave it to heal. He watched her hands as if the small work mattered. "You've got a steady touch," he said. "I've had practice." She tied off the thread and trimmed it with neat snips. The wind pushed at the door and the lantern hissed. She lifted another log to the stove. When she turned back, his eyes were still on her. Not like a man staring, more like a man deciding something heavy. He set his hat on his knee and said it the way a man might say the weather was turning. "No man will ever hurt you again." Clara felt the floor under her boots as if it had moved. She did not step back. She only let the cloth fall into the basin and reached for another to dry his hand. That's a wide promise to make to a woman you've just met. I've seen enough hurt to know what it looks like when it hasn't finished with someone. His gaze dropped, not to the thin white marks near her wrist hidden well, but to the way she flinched when the wind struck the door. "You've been standing alone. Long enough." People sometimes tried to be kind. They brought bread. They said she was brave. No one had said words like his, solid as fence posts, as if he meant to build something with them and live inside it. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to tell him she did not need a giant to stand in her doorway and swear on the wind. But the room was very quiet and his voice was not a shout. It was a promise laid down like a plank. "You'll want to keep such thoughts to yourself," she said, gentler than she felt. "Folks talk." "I don't mind talk." He slid one hand into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a folded paper. He did not unfold it. He held it in both hands as if it was heavy. "I came to bring you this." Clara did not move, and so he set it on the counter. The paper was thick. The edges were worn like he had taken it out and put it back many times. "What is it?" "An agreement," he said. "Plain words, not pretty. I won't dress it up. You'd have a home at the Boone place, a key to your own door. Your clinic stays open. I'll put money towards supplies. You do as you please with patients. I ask for your hand and your name and the right to stand between you and any man who tries you again." She knew men who wrapped their wants in sweet talk. He had none of that. His words were clean-cut boards, nailed one after the other. She could feel heat in her face, and did not know if it was anger or something else. She looked down. Her small wooden keepsake, an unfinished sparrow someone had carved for her on the wagon, Wes sat near the ledger. She touched its wing with her thumb. She had kept it all these years as a reminder that even rough hands could make gentle things. She did not look up until she trusted her voice. "Marriage," she said. He nodded once. "A partnership. I won't lie about love. I don't know how it's supposed to look in books. I know work. I know keeping storms off the roof. I know staying. If feelings come, we'll tend them. If not, you'll still be safe and respected. I've got room and need for a woman with a spine. You've got a town that leans hard on you and leaves you alone at night. This fixes both." He had set his jaw like a man ready for a blow. It made something in her loosen and then tighten again. The wind rattled the glass. Far off, a coyote called. She thought of the night she had barred the door and sat with a pistol and listened for footsteps that did not stop until they reached her porch. She thought of the names she had been called: spinster, saint, stubborn, and the names she had not heard in years: wife, beloved, because they had belonged to a life that had closed like a door. "Why me?" she said. She heard the roughness in it and did not try to smooth it out. "Because you stand," he said, "and because I want to stand with you." He pushed the paper closer. She did not touch it. She looked at his hands instead, big and scarred, resting open on the counter. They were not threatening hands. They were building hands. She let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped since the train left St. Louis. "People will talk hard," she said. "They already do," he said. "Let them say I married the bravest woman in the territory." She almost smiled. Not quite. The lantern hissed again. He took his hat and set it on his head and rose. He seemed to fill the little room all over again, and yet she did not feel crowded. She felt like the room had grown to meet him. "I'll ride back in 2 days," he said softly. "You can hand me that paper or hand it back. Either way, I'll see you home if it's dark." He stepped out into the wind, and the door settled behind him. The room felt strange without him in it, as if the air had shifted shape. Clara stood a long time with her hand on the small wooden sparrow, listening to the night. At last she drew the bolt and turned the lantern down until the flame was small and steady. Only then did she unfold the paper and see that the words were exactly as he had promised: plain, careful, and signed in a hand that did not shake. She read it twice. She could not tell if the ache in her chest was fear leaving or hope arriving. She set the paper beneath the sparrow and told herself she would sleep. She did not. Near midnight the window rattled. She rose and went to it. Something hit the glass and fell. When she opened the door, a smooth river stone lay on the step. Tied to it was a note in a hand she knew too well, the letters cut sharp and mean. "Marry Boone, and you won't live to regret it." Clara shut the door. She locked it. She stood in the middle of the room with the note in her hand and felt the old past reach for her like a cold hand. Then she walked back to the counter and laid the note beside Elias Boone's careful agreement, as if to weigh them against each other. The lantern burned on. Outside, the wind moved through the hills. Inside, she stood very still and did not break. The morning light came thin and gold through the frost on the windows. Clara sat at her table, the coffee cooling in her cup, both the folded agreement and the crumpled note in front of her like two opposing pieces of evidence. One was written in a steady hand, with lines measured and promises set like fence posts. The other was scratched in a way she knew too well, jagged, impatient, each letter cut into the paper like a threat. She didn't need to read it again. The words had burned themselves into her thoughts through the long night. "Marry Boone, and you won't live to regret it." The meaning was sharp and double-edged, meant to scare, meant to remind her that some ghost wore boots and had long shadows. She'd seen him in town 2 days ago. Not Elias. Him. Just for a second, across the street outside the Mercantile. A slant of his hat, a turn of the head, and she'd told herself she was mistaken. That man belonged to another life, far from here. But now the note on her table laughed at her denial. The sound of wagon wheels pulled her from her thoughts. She rose, smoothing her skirt out of habit, and went to the window. It was Mrs. Teller, her oldest patient, coming to have her knee looked at. Clara tucked both papers into the drawer under the table before she let her in. Life on the frontier didn't stop for fear. Knees still ached, babies still coughed, wounds still needed stitching. She would treat Mrs. Teller, then the Cooper boy's rash, then finish the inventory of supplies before snow came. She would not let her hands shake. By afternoon, she'd done the work of an ordinary day, and yet every knock on the door, every shadow that moved past the clinic, sent her eyes to the rifle propped behind the counter. When the door opened near sunset, she turned too quickly, ready for trouble. But it was Elias Boone filling her doorway again. This time the wind did not follow him inside, it seemed to stop at his back, as if it knew he carried enough weight on his own. "I'll take that coffee if you've got any left," he said. His voice was as even as before, but his eyes scanned the room like he could read the air. Clara poured from the pot on the stove. "You've come for your answer." "I said I'd give you 2 days," he replied, taking the cup. "That makes this the second." She reached into the drawer and set the folded agreement on the counter between them. His eyes went to it, but she didn't let him reach for it yet. Instead, she pulled out the other paper, the note, and laid it beside it. He read the note without touching it. His jaw worked once, slow, and the muscles in his forearms tightened where they rested on the counter. "Who?" he asked. She told him in a low voice, watching the way he went still. Not with surprise, but with the kind of quiet that comes when a man's thoughts turn toward something dangerous. "You know him?" she asked. "Number. But I know the type. Mean runs in their bones. Think fear is the only way to get their will." She swallowed. "He used to think I belonged to him." "Not anymore," Elias said. They stood like that for a moment, the two papers between them, one a promise, one a threat. Clara could hear the ticking of the clock over the stove. She thought about all the miles she'd put between herself and that man, all the nights she had locked her door and told herself a distance was enough. It had not been. "I'll marry you," she said quietly. Elias looked at her with a steadiness that made the words feel like more than a transaction. "This isn't just about that note, Clara. It's about not living with my back to the door," she said. "It's about not listening for boots on the porch every night. And," she paused, looking straight at him, "it's about you. You don't talk like other men. You don't promise things you can't keep. That matters to me." He took the agreement and folded it with care before sliding it into his coat pocket. "We'll talk to Reverend Matthews in the morning," he said, "and until then, I'll walk you home and sit by your fire until you're ready to sleep." She almost told him no, that she didn't need a guard, but the note was still on the counter, and she could not pretend her hands were steady when she picked it up. So she nodded. The walk to her small rented house was cold, the wind coming down sharper now, hinting at snow in the higher ridges. Elias walked close enough that his coat brushed her sleeve. His stride slowed to match hers. The streets were thinning of people. A few men on the porch of the saloon glanced their way, but none spoke. She noticed that they looked at Elias first, then quickly away. Inside, she lit the lamp and set the kettle on the stove. Elias didn't take a chair. He moved through the small space once, checking the window latches and the bolt on the back door, then took up a place near the front with his coat still on, watching the dark street through the curtain's edge. It should have felt intrusive. It didn't. It felt like he was the only solid thing between her and the memory of a past that had followed her across states. When the tea was ready, she handed him a cup. He took it, but didn't drink right away. "If this man shows himself again, I want to know. If he sends word, if he even looks your way, and if he does, then I'll answer him in a way he'll understand." She believed him. It was not said with bluster or heat, just quiet certainty, like the way he had said, "I'll keep the storms off the roof." They talked little after that. She worked on the clinic ledger at the table. He sat by the front window, still as a stone, his large frame making the chair seem small. When she finally rose to say she was going to bed, he stood too. "I'll see you in the morning," he said. "We'll make it right." She locked the door behind him, and for the first time in years she did not check it twice before climbing into bed. Out on the street, Elias Boone walked toward his horse with the weight of the agreement in his pocket and the shape of Clara Whitmore's fear in his mind. He knew the kind of men who thought a woman could be owned, and he knew one thing with certainty. This one was about to learn what happened when he reached for what now belonged to Elias Boone. The morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of cold that bit at fingertips and turned every breath into a puff of ghost. Clara stood at the wash basin in her narrow kitchen, watching the frost melt off the window pane as she poured water from the kettle. She had barely slept, though she had felt safer than she had in weeks knowing Elias Boone had walked her home. Now, with her hair pinned neatly and her coat buttoned, she waited for his knock. They had agreed to see Reverend Matthews first thing, and she didn't intend to keep him waiting. The knock came low and solid. When she opened the door, Elias stood there with his hat in hand, frost in his beard, and an expression as steady as the hills. He was dressed plain, but she noticed he'd brushed his coat clean and shined his boots. He looked like a man walking into something he'd already decided he could live with. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, taking her gloves from the table. "Let's get it done before I lose my nerve." He said nothing to that, just held the door for her and followed her out into the crisp morning. They walked side by side down the hard-packed street. It was quiet but for the creak of wagon wheels and the jingle of a distant harness. People noticed the mom eyes tracking from her to Elias and back again, but no one called out. Reverend Matthews's church sat at the far end of town, a simple clapboard building with a bell that had rung for weddings and funerals in equal measure. The Reverend was a short man with kind eyes and a voice that could soften stone. He seemed unsurprised when they told him their purpose, only nodding slowly as if the wind had already carried him the news. "Do you want it private?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said quickly before Elias could answer. "Just the words we need. No more." The Reverend smiled faintly. "Words are important, Miss Whitmore. Sometimes the fewest carry the most weight. They set the ceremony for the following morning time enough," the Reverend said, "for the paperwork to be witnessed and the vows prepared." Clara felt a mix of relief and apprehension as they stepped back into the cold. Elias kept his silence until they reached her clinic. "It'll be quick," he said. "You'll have my name, and that will change things." She gave a short laugh. "It'll certainly change the talk." He glanced at her then, his eyes catching hers for a moment. "Let 'em talk. Long as you know you've got someone to stand with you, it won't matter." They were halfway up the step to the clinic when the sound of boots on the boardwalk behind them made Clara stop. She knew that rhythm measured, confident, carrying a weight of its own. Her stomach knotted before she turned. A man stood about 20 paces away, hat tipped low, coat collar turned against the cold. Even at that distance she saw the curve of his smile. It was the same one she'd seen in doorways, in lamplight, just before a word meant to bruise. "Well, if it ain't Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying down the quiet street like a blade scraping stone. "Or is it Miss now? You've been keeping busy, I hear." Elias shifted slightly, not enough to block her view, but enough that she felt the shield of his presence between them. "You've said enough," he told the man. The man's gaze slid to Elias, measuring. "You must be Boone. I've heard the stories. Big man, big spread, keeps to himself. Guess that's changing." His eyes came back to Clara. "Shame. I thought we had unfinished business." Her mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, but the words caught, tangled in old fear. Elias's voice cut through, calm and low. "You got business? You bring it to me. You so much as breathe in her direction again, you'll answer for it." The man's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he tipped his hat mockingly and turned away. His boots carried him toward the saloon, the sound fading with each step, but the echo stayed sharp in Clara's ears. Elias waited until he was gone from sight. "You know him," he said. She nodded, feeling the tremor in her own hands. "Too well. I thought I'd left him behind for good." "Seems he's found his way here." Elias's tone was controlled, but she saw the tension in his jaw. "You tell me everything. What he's capable of. What he's done. Don't leave anything out." It was not a request. It was a command softened by concern, and she found herself obeying. Inside the clinic, she told him more than she'd told anyone in years. How she'd been 19 when she married a man who seemed charming and steady. How that charm turned to control, then cruelty. How she'd escaped with nothing but the clothes on her back and the carved wooden sparrow she kept on her table. When she finished, Elias stood by the stove, one hand braced on the mantel. His eyes were dark, but his voice was even. "He won't get another chance." "Men like him don't stop," she said. "Men like him learn," he answered. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let that certainty settle into her bones. But the image of that smirk on the street stayed with her. She knew the kind of games her former husband played. He wouldn't come straight at them. He would chip at the edges, unsettle her in ways that wouldn't draw a lawman's attention. Elias seemed to read her thoughts. "Tomorrow we marry," he said. "After that you're under my roof, and he'll know he's not just dealing with you anymore." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, not as a man taking possession, but as a man drawing a line in the ground that no one crossed. She didn't argue. She only nodded, her fingers curling around the edge of the table where the sparrow sat. She could almost feel the grain of the wood beneath her gloves, and she remembered how she'd carried it west as proof she could survive what had been done to her. That night, the wind rose again, and she lay in bed listening to it rattle the shutters. But over the sound, she kept hearing Elias's voice in her mind, steady as fence posts. No man will ever hurt you again. She didn't know yet if that was a promise the world would allow him to keep, but she knew he meant it, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe someone might stand their ground for her. Snow came in the night, soft at first, then heavy enough to lay a white blanket over the rooftops and mute the town's usual creaks and groans. Clara woke to the pale hush of it, the kind of quiet that made the world feel far away. She rose early, dressed in her good blue wool dress, the one she'd decided would do for a wedding, and tied her hair in a low twist at the nape of her neck. Her hands trembled only a little as she fastened the last button. Outside, the street looked transformed, each boardwalk swept in clean strokes by the wind, the tracks of wagons already filling with snow. She was lighting the stove when the knock came. Elias stood there in his long coat, snow-dusting his shoulders, his dark hair brushed neat. He looked like a man who had slept well, though she doubted that was true. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," she replied, and stepped aside to let him in. He did a quick scan of the room habit, she guessed, before turning back to her. "Ready?" She glanced toward the small carved sparrow on the table, its wings half open as if caught in flight. "Yes." The church smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine boughs when they entered. Reverend Matthews was already waiting, a worn Bible open on the lectern. Two witnesses stood near the back, Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile and Sheriff Kinney, whose presence was more about formality than friendship. The ceremony was exactly as Clara had asked, short, plain, and without frills. She spoke her vows in a voice steadier than she expected. Elias's deep, "I do," carried like the rumble of distant thunder. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Elias did not reach for her the way some men might have. Instead, he took her hand gently, lifted it, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was quiet, but so deliberate it made the back of her throat ache. Outside, the snow had thickened, and the cold seemed sharper now that they were bound to each other. Elias helped her into his wagon, the boards creaking under his weight as he climbed in beside her. The ride out of town was nearly silent, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. The snow muffled the wheels, and the landscape blurred into shades of white and grey. When the Boone Ranch house came into view, Clara was surprised at the sight of smoke curling from both chimneys. Inside, it was warm, the fire already crackling in the big stone hearth. The main room was larger than she had imagined, with shelves lined in books, a wide table, and a pair of armchairs that looked well worn but comfortable. "I've put you in the east bedroom," Elias said, carrying her small trunk upstairs. "Morning light comes in strong through those windows. Figured you'd like that for reading or working." She followed him up, noting the solid feel of the stairs under her boots. The room he'd chosen was spacious, with a small writing desk by the window and a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Her belongings were already arranged in the wardrobe and on the dresser. She touched the quilt. It was hand-stitched, the patterns worn but even. "It's more than I expected," she admitted. "I want you comfortable here," he said simply. They shared a midday meal beef stew he had made himself with fresh bread still warm from the oven. The conversation was cautious, touching on her patients and the coming winter, his cattle and the state of the north pasture fence. But now and then she caught him watching her with a kind of quiet study, as if measuring how she fit in the space around him. Later he showed her the rest of the house. The kitchen with its neat rows of jars and sacks, the pantry stocked for winter, the small parlour where the upright piano stood against one wall. "Can you play?" she asked. "Not a note," he said. "It was my mother's." She brushed her fingers over the keys, not pressing down, just feeling the cool smoothness. "I used to," she said. "Before?" She didn't finish, and he didn't press. That evening the snow fell harder, tapping against the windows like soft fingers. Clara unpacked the last of her things, placing the sparrow on the writing desk where she could see it from the bed. Downstairs, Elias moved about quietly, the sounds of firewood being stacked, and the low murmur of a kettle on the stove drifting up to her. After supper, they sat in the main room. She read through a medical text by lamplight, and he worked on mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and thread. The only sounds were the fire's crackle and the occasional turn of a page. It felt, in an odd way, like peace. But as the night wore on, she found herself glancing toward the windows. The memory of her former husband's smirk on the street had lodged itself in her mind like a burr. She thought of how men like him could wait out a storm, slipping in only when the ground had thawed enough to leave a mark. As if sensing her unease, Elias set down his work. "You're thinking about him." She didn't deny it. "I know he's not gone. Men like that don't just disappear." "No," Elias agreed, "but he won't get near you. Not here." It wasn't bluster. It was fact, stated as plainly as if he'd said the roof was solid or the fire hot. And somehow, that steadiness made her chest ease a fraction. Before retiring to their separate rooms, he paused at the bottom of the stairs. "If you hear anything in the night, call for me. Doesn't matter the hour," she nodded. "And if you do—" "I'll already be up," he said, and she knew he meant it. Upstairs, she undressed slowly, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters. She glanced once more at the sparrow on the desk, its unfinished wings angled toward the window. It looked ready to fly but anchored, as if it knew it had found a place worth staying. She lay in bed, the quilt warm against her, and let the fire's fading glow from downstairs soften the dark. Somewhere beyond the walls, danger might be waiting. But for the first time in years, she had the sense that she wasn't the only one keeping watch. When she drifted into sleep, it was with the sound of the snow falling and the certainty, fragile but growing, that she was no longer facing her past alone. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and familiar. Clara rose early each morning, the smell of coffee already drifting from the kitchen, where Elias had been up before dawn. They shared breakfast without much ceremony. He spoke little in the mornings, but she found herself filling the quiet with small pieces of news from town or the clinic. After the meal, she would walk to the schoolhouse, her boots crunching on the packed snow while Elias set out toward the pastures or barns, a dark figure moving steady against the white fields. It was during those days she noticed how the ranch, large as it was, bore his touch everywhere. Fences mended with precision, tools oiled and stored in neat rows, barns swept clean even in winter. Elias Boone worked the land like a man keeping a vow to it, and it gave her a curious sense of safety, as though the same hands that kept the fence straight might also hold back the world if it came for her. But the peace was never complete. She could feel eyes on her sometimes when she walked through town, the weight of a gaze she didn't dare confirm. The clinic door was found ajar one morning, though she was sure she'd locked it. Nothing was taken, but a small bottle of laudanum was tipped over on her desk, and a thin slice of paper lay under it. Still here, 2 words, no signature. She didn't tell Elias that day. Part of her wanted to keep the old life out of the new, to guard the one place she had started to feel settled. But that night, while drying dishes beside him, she heard the question in his voice before he asked it. "Something happened today?" She kept her eyes on the plate she was wiping. "Just the usual patience." "That's not what I asked." She set the plate down. The truth pushed at her. "Someone came into the clinic when I wasn't there. Left a note." He stopped drying, set the cup down on the counter. "Show me." The paper was still in her coat pocket. She handed it to him without speaking. He read it once, twice, then slid it into his own pocket. "You tell me next time it happens, no holding back." "I didn't want to. I don't care what you wanted to spare me. If there's a threat in this house, I deal with it." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. Not from fear, but from something dangerously close to relief. The next Sunday they went to church together, and she noticed how people's eyes changed when they walked arm in arm. Some looked pleased, some curious, others tight-lipped, and then she saw Marcus Blackwell. He owned the spread west of Boone Land, a man known for his wealth and his way of making trouble without ever getting his boots dirty. He was standing by the church steps, speaking, with the sheriff, but his gaze fixed on them as they approached. "Boone," he said, nodding. "Blackwell." Elias's reply was as flat as the frozen ground. Blackwell's eyes flicked to Clara, lingered a moment too long. "And this must be the new Mrs. Boone. I've been hearing plenty about you." "I'm sure you have," Clara said, and Elias's arm tightened slightly under her hand. Blackwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You know, marriage changes a man's priorities, changes the way he thinks about his property. Sometimes a neighbour's offer starts to sound more reasonable when he has a wife to consider. Not this neighbour's offer, Elias said. Blackwell's smile thinned. Well, the winter's long. We'll see. That night, Elias sat by the fire, sharpening a small knife with slow, careful strokes. Clara worked on her ledgers at the table, but she could feel the tension in the room. Finally, she asked, "What does Blackwell want?" "North pasture," Elias said without looking up. "Been after it for years. Thinks if he can push hard enough, I'll give it up." "And you won't?" He set the knife down, met her eyes. "Not while I'm breathing." The next few days brought more signs. A stretch of fence on the far edge of the pasture cut clean through, hoofprints circling the barn in the night, and one morning, a dead crow left on the front step, its wings stiff with frost. Elias didn't speak when he saw it. He picked it up with a scrap of burlap, carried it past the barn, and buried it in the snow. When he came back in, he said only, "He's not working alone." That evening, Clara stayed in the kitchen after supper, peeling apples for a pie she'd promised to bring to Mrs. Henderson. Elias came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, his coat heavy with frost. "You shouldn't go into town alone tomorrow," he said. "I've been going alone since I came here." "And now you're not alone anymore," he replied. "That means I've got a say." She wanted to bristle at that, but the truth was, she felt a flicker of something else. Gratitude edged with fear. If Blackwell was in league with her former husband, it was more than land at stake. Later that night, she found herself standing at the window, watching the snow drift under the moonlight. Elias passed behind her on his way to the stairs. He stopped, followed her gaze out to the dark fields. "They'll test us," he said quietly. "Try to see how far they can push. We'll show them." Her reflection in the glass caught the faintest ghost of a smile. "We?" "We," he said, and for the first time since the wedding, the word felt like a binding stronger than any vow. The wind had shifted in the night, carrying the sharp tang of smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge. Clara noticed it as soon as she stepped out to fetch water from the pump, her breath pluming in the brittle air. She turned slowly, scanning the snow-covered hills, and there far off she saw a dark smudge curling into the sky. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't from a chimney. It was too heavy, too wild. She was still staring when Elias came from the barn, coat collar turned up, a rope coiled in one hand. His eyes followed hers to the smoke. He didn't curse, didn't shout, just dropped the rope and began striding toward the pasture where his horse was tied. "What is it?" she called, hurrying after him. "Barn," he said, his voice flat and clipped. "Not ours. The south line. Could be a warning." She didn't like the way he said that. By the time he was in the saddle, she'd thrown her coat over her dress and was at his side. "I'm coming." "No," he said without even looking at her. "If it's what I think, you're safer here." Clara shook her head. "If it's what you think, you shouldn't be riding into it alone." His eyes met hers for a long second, measuring. Then, with a short nod, he held down a hand and pulled her up behind him. They rode fast, the wind biting at their faces, the snow flying from the horses' hooves. The barn belonged to one of Elias's hands, a man named Price who kept a small spread just inside Boonland. By the time they arrived, the roof had caved, flames licking what little was left of the walls. Price was stomping through the snow with a bucket, his breath coming hard. "Got the stock out," he called over the roar. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Lantern oil poured straight along the wall. Elias's face didn't change, but Clara saw the muscle in his jaw jump. "You see anyone?" Price shook his head. "Tracks in the snow, though." More than one set. Elias didn't need to say whose tracks they might be. Clara could see it in his eyes. This wasn't random trouble, this was a message. On the ride back, neither spoke much. The cold seemed sharper now, biting through her gloves, cutting at her cheeks. She could feel the tension in Elias's back under her hands, the way his shoulders stayed tight as they crested each hill. When the ranch house came into sight, Elias slowed the horse. "They'll try again," he said, his voice low, "and they won't always aim for property." "You mean me?" Clara said. "I mean anything they think will make me give ground," he replied. "That includes you." Her pulse beat hard in her ears. She thought of the note in her coat, the crow on the step, the smirk she'd seen in town. "What do? We make it clear they'll regret it if they cross the line." That evening Elias began reinforcing the doors, adding an iron bar to the kitchen entrance and checking each window latch twice. Clara worked beside him without needing to be asked, holding nails, fetching tools. It was almost dark when hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Both froze. Elias moved to the window, easing the curtain back just enough to look. 2 riders, he said. Not from here! The knock that followed was hard, deliberate. Elias opened the door only halfway. Evening, Boone, said the man in front. His coat too fine for ranch work, his smile too easy. Name's Evers. My boss, Mr. Blackwell, asked me to extend an invitation. Elias didn't move. Not interested. Evers' smile widened. He thought you might say that. But he figured your new wife might appreciate a neighbourly supper. Seems a shame for her to be cooped up here all winter without meeting folks. Clara's fingers curled into her skirt. She stayed in the shadows, but she could see the glint in the man's eyes, mocking, daring. You tell Blackwell to keep his supper, Elias said, his tone like ice, and to keep his men off my land. Evers shrugged. Your choice. Just thought it polite to ask before the winter gets too long. He tipped his hat toward the door, as if he knew she was standing just inside, and turned his horse toward the road. When they were gone, Elias shut the door hard enough to rattle the windows. They're testing us, he said, seeing how close they can get without drawing blood. Clara crossed her arms. And what do we do when they decide to stop asking politely? Elias's gaze found hers. Then we stopped being polite too. The next day the snow turned to a wet, heavy fall, and the sky hung low and grey. Clara went about her chores in the kitchen, but her mind was restless. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the wind outside set her on edge. She knew they couldn't sit waiting forever. By afternoon, Elias returned from the pasture with his coat soaked through. Tracks again, he said, unbuttoning it. Circling the north fence, they're watching. She dried his coat by the fire while he changed, then brought him a mug of coffee. Maybe we should go to the sheriff, she said. Elias shook his head. Kinney's no friend of Blackwell's, but he's not eager to tangle with him either. Law's slow. This kind of thing needs a faster answer. What kind of answer? The kind that makes a man think twice before he comes back. That night they sat together in the parlour, her reading by the lamp, him oiling the rifle across his knees. The sound of the cloth sliding over the metal was steady, methodical. At one point he looked up at her. If they come while I'm not here, you take the pistol from the desk drawer and you aim for the middle. Don't hesitate. She met his gaze, seeing no trace of doubt there. I won't. Outside the wind began to rise, rattling the shutters like an impatient hand, and in the steady quiet between gusts Clara thought she could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats on packed snow, somewhere out there in the dark. The storm blew itself out overnight, leaving the world glazed in ice and silence. Clara woke to find frost on the inside of the window pane, delicate as lace. Downstairs, Elias was already gone, the fire built high in the hearth and a note on the table in his square, plain hand, checking north pasture. Back by noon. She drank her coffee by the window, the stillness of the morning broken only by the occasional creak of the house in the cold. But beneath the quiet, there was a tautness in the air she couldn't name. She busied herself with the mending, pile though her ears stayed tuned for any sound beyond the walls. It was near mid-morning when she heard it, the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground. Too slow for Elias's stride, too heavy for one of the ranch hands. Her breath caught. The sound stopped just short of the front porch. A knock came, not loud but deliberate. Clara set aside the mending and moved to the desk where the pistol lay in the top drawer. She kept her voice steady. Who's there? Just an old friend, came the answer, and her heart froze harder than the ground outside. She opened the door only a fraction, enough to see the man she'd hoped never to face again. He looked almost the same eyes that smiled without warmth, the tilt of his head as if he were in on some private joke. The years had deepened the lines around his mouth, but the air of possession was unchanged. Thought I'd pay a call, he said. See how married life suits you. You shouldn't be here, she said, gripping the pistol hidden in the drawer behind her. He stepped closer, his boot on the first porch board. I hear you've taken up with Boone. Big man, big talk. You think he can keep you from me? Her voice didn't rise. I know he can. He smiled at that, slow and ugly. We'll see. Before she could answer, another sound cut through the air, the distant thunder of hooves growing fast. The man's smile faltered just as Elias came into view, riding hard from the north, snow spraying up behind his horse. He was off before the animal fully stopped. closing the distance to the porch in 3 long strides. "You've got 3 seconds to turn around," Elias said, his voice like gravel over stone. The man raised his hands, mocking surrender. "No harm done, just passing the time." "1," Elias said. Her former husband hesitated, then stepped back slowly. "We'll talk again." 2. That was enough. He turned, walked to his horse tied just beyond the gate, and swung into the saddle. His eyes met Clara's once before he wheeled the animal around and rode off at a steady pace, too proud to show haste. Elias didn't watch him go. He came up the porch and looked at her instead. "You all right?" She nodded, though her knees felt weak. "I had the pistol ready." His gaze softened a fraction. "Good." Inside, he shrugged out of his coat but didn't sit. "That was him?" "Yes." "Then it's time we stop waiting for him to come to us," she frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's not working alone, and Blackwell's got his hand in this. They'll press until they think we're about to break, so we make the first move." It was the first time she'd heard Elias speak of going on the offensive, and it both unsettled and reassured her. "What does that look like?" "Canyon trail," he said. "They've been using it to cross onto my land without being seen. Tonight we make sure they know they're not welcome." She thought of the canyon narrow, hemmed in by high rock, where the wind funneled through like a whispering voice. It was the kind of place where 2 men could stand off a dozen if they knew the ground. "I'm coming," she said. His eyes narrowed. "It's not your fight to stand in the canyon. It became mine the moment he stepped on this porch." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a short nod. "Stay behind me. Always." They left after nightfall, bundled in heavy coats, the horse's breath steaming in the cold. The snow underhoof was crusted hard, carrying them fast toward the jagged break in the hills where the canyon began. The moon was thin, the stars sharp. They tied the horses in the shadow of a stand of pines and moved on foot, the crunch of their boots swallowed by the canyon's cold walls. Elias carried his rifle. Clara kept her hand close to the pistol in her coat pocket. They didn't wait long. The first sound came low. A murmured voice carried on the wind, then the faint jingle of tack. 2 riders, just as Elias had said. Their shapes emerged from the dark mouth of the trail, silhouettes against the lighter snow. Elias stepped out from the shadow, rifle loose in his hands but ready. "You're on Boonland," he called, voice carrying in the stillness. The riders pulled up, one of them laughing softly. "Just passing through." "Turn around," Elias said. "Now." Something in his tone must have carried, because the second rider shifted in his saddle. But the first leaned forward, his voice edged with challenge. "Or what?" Elias didn't answer. The click of the rifle's lever was all the reply he gave. The sound was small, but in the canyon's stillness it cracked like a whip. The men hesitated, then wheeled their horses. Snow sprayed from under the hooves as they rode back the way they'd come, their shapes swallowed by the dark. Elias lowered the rifle only when the sound had faded completely. He looked back at Clara. "That's the first warning. They won't get another." On the ride home, the cold cut through their coats, but Clara felt a heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the realization that she wasn't running anymore, not from the man in town, not from his threats, not from the ghosts of her past. Elias glanced over at her as they neared the ranch. "You did well tonight." She held his gaze for a moment. "So did you." The porch light glowed ahead, a small, steady flame against the dark, and for the first time in years she found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, it would keep burning. Dawn came pale and windless, the snow crusted under a thin glaze of ice. Clara woke before the light was full, the unease from the canyon still heavy in her chest. Elias had slept little. She knew it by the faint creak of the floorboards during the night, the sound of him moving between window and door like a man expecting company. She brewed coffee, the scent filling the warm kitchen, and set a cup at his place. He came in from the yard, stamping frost from his boots. "North fence is quiet," he said, hanging his coat. "Too quiet." Before she could answer, a hard knock came at the front door, not hesitant, not polite. Elias crossed the room in 3 strides and opened it just enough to see the man on the porch. It was Blackwell himself, coat collar up, eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite a smile. Behind him stood Clara's former husband, hands resting lightly on his belt, hat low over his brow. "Morning, Boone," Blackwell said. We thought we'd settle this face to face, save everyone some trouble. You've already made trouble, Elias replied. Blackwell's gaze flicked past him to Clara. Mrs. Boone. My, but you've got spirit. Shame it's being wasted out here. Elias stepped fully into the doorway, blocking the view. Say what you came to say. Blackwell's tone stayed smooth. You sign over the north pasture. We'll be gone by sundown. No more visits. No more trouble for your wife. Clara's former husband shifted, his smirk curling. Or you hold out, and maybe she starts remembering why she left me in the first place. Something in Elias's face went still. You're not touching her. Ever. The air seemed to tighten, the cold biting sharper. Clara could feel her pulse in her throat. Your choice, Blackwell said, but the offer won't be this generous again. Elias stepped back as if to close the door. We don't deal with thieves. The door shut hard enough to rattle the hinges. Elias turned to her. They won't walk away from this. What do we do? He looked at her, steady. We finish it. Today. Within the hour they were riding toward town, the cold slicing at their faces. Elias didn't speak until they hit the main street. Public, he said. Make it public, where they can't hide behind whispers. They found Blackwell and the other man outside the saloon, just as if they'd been waiting. Elias dismounted, his boots striking the hard-packed snow with a sound that carried. Clara stayed mounted but close, her gloved hand resting on the pistol in her coat pocket. This ends here, Elias said, his voice pitched to carry across the street. You've trespassed. You've threatened my wife. You've damaged my land. You get one chance to walk away. Blackwell laughed, low and dismissive. And if we don't? Elias stepped closer, his shadow falling long in the morning light. Then you'll wish you had. The street had gone quiet, townsfolk watching from windows and doorways. Clara's former husband took a slow step forward, the smirk never leaving his face. You think you scare me, Boone? You think she's yours because you've got a piece of paper and a bigger frame? Clara's voice cut through, steady as the frost. He doesn't need to scare you. He just needs to stop you. Her former husband turned toward her, something ugly flickering in his eyes, then froze as she drew the pistol from her pocket, holding it level. Last time you had your hands on me, I didn't have a choice. Now I do. Elias didn't look at her, didn't need to. His voice stayed calm. You heard her. Blackwell's smile thinned. You've made an enemy you can't afford, Boone. Elias took one slow step closer until they were nearly chest to chest. You've made one you can't beat. Something in the way he said it, measured unshaken, must have landed because Blackwell looked away first. Let's go, he said to the other man, turning toward his horse. Her former husband hesitated a beat longer, meeting her gaze with a look that promised this wasn't over. But when Elias's shadow shifted, he followed Blackwell without another word. The two rode out of town, their figures shrinking against the white hills until they vanished. Elias turned then, scanning the faces in the street. Anyone else thinking of crossing onto Boone land think again? No one answered. The ride home was quiet. Clara kept her eyes on the line of the hills, the air sharp in her lungs. When the ranch came into view, the chimney smoke curling into the pale sky, she felt something in her ease, like a knot loosening. Inside, she set the pistol back in the desk drawer. Elias hung his coat and came to stand beside her, his voice low. It's not over. Men like that, sometimes they keep coming. But they'll know now it won't be easy. She looked up at him, at the calm weight in his eyes. No man will ever hurt me again, she said, repeating the words he'd once spoken to her. He didn't smile, but something in his gaze softened. Not while I'm here. That night, as the wind moved low through the pines and the fire threw its light against the walls, Clara sat at her desk and ran her fingers over the carved sparrow. It had flown far to find a safe perch, and maybe, just maybe, it had found one. She looked toward Elias, reading quietly in the armchair, and felt the faintest pull at her lips. They had stood their ground, together, and she knew they would again. If you were drawn into Clara and Elias's fight for safety and love on the frontier, you'll want to keep riding with them. Their land, their vows, and their hearts will be tested again. The next storm is already on the horizon. Will they be ready? Saddle up and find out in the next story.